Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Genevieve Caufield. She's a final year history PhD candidate at University College London, and her doctoral thesis is titled, Can We Believe Our Own Eyes? Optics, Vision, and Cognition in Late Medieval Religion. Her main research interests are the integrated approach to the history and philosophy of science, intellectual history, and the history of religion. Genevieve, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on my first podcast.
Your first ever podcast. I hope that you find it an enjoyable experience and you're not put off of podcasting forever. So today you're here to speak to us about Dorothea of Montau.
Yes, that's correct.
But before we talk about her, let's talk a little bit more about you. I know from your research that you study a lot of different mystical women, but how did you first find yourself studying mystics generally, studying these kind of devotional texts?
Well, I'd say I sort of fell into it by accident, almost. So as you correctly said, my doctoral thesis is mainly about optics and theories of vision. And I wanted to write a chapter about saints and holy people who experienced visions from God. And when I was looking into who those people might be, a lot of them were mystics, unsurprisingly. So from there, I started with the hagiography and have only more recently started to understand what mysticism is more broadly than just a bunch of saints seeing God.
Fantastic. And when you say you were coming at this initially from vision and from optics and from the sense of sight, as it were, do you find that there is a connection there between seeing in a sensorial sense and seeing in a visionary sense?
So that's a really interesting part of what I found, I think. When you read about visionaries seeing God, sometimes it absolutely is described as happening through the physical sense of sight. And at other times, it's quite explicitly not physical at all. So you have the Augustinian hierarchy of types of sight. You have physical, spiritual, and intellectual. And what I find really fascinating is you have some mystics and hagiographers who want to say, oh, my visions were purely intellectual, no representations or physical intermediaries were part of these visions. And others are saying, no, I actually did see this with my bodily eyes. It was something concrete, and sort of teasing out those distinctions and trying to figure out why they were arguing for these different types of vision is something that really interests me.
It is really interesting that some of them are so specific about how they're seeing these things and what it means to them to see these things, when in other cases, the mystics clearly don't even know for themselves. You know, we have that with Paul in the third heaven of not knowing if it was in the body or out of the body, where they were, whether these are real spaces or constructed, what they are seeing and in what way. So when we have the differences between the kinds of seeing acknowledged in these texts, I always find that really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, that's something that's really cool about Dorothea, is there is so much variety in the way her confessor writes about her visions. Yeah, he really looks at all levels and sort of decides which one makes the most sense for the type of source he's writing. At least that's what I think.
What an absolutely perfect segue into our discussion of Dorothea. So, as we mentioned, you talk about a lot of mystical and holy women. So, thinking back to your first impressions of Dorothea, do you remember what you first thought when you came across her?
Yes, I do need to cast my mind back a little bit. I would say my first impression was excitement, because, so to give a bit of sort of pragmatic context, I started really seriously looking into mystics during COVID when I had little access to library materials. So I was using the online Acta Sanctorum. And in looking through this database, I was really just looking for lives of saints, or prospective saints, as she was at the time, whose hagiographers wrote a lot about sight, just visio root words was what I was looking for. And there were hundreds in Dorothea's sources. And there were also, I think, two quite long Latin lives for her, Vita Prima and Vita Lindana. So yeah, I was really excited to see that, because that gave me the opportunity to look into how she had been represented differently the first time her confessor, John Marienwerder, was writing a life for her, and how he sort of edited himself to write the next one, Vita Lindana.
It is so cool to have two different versions of the text written by the same person. I mean, we talk about the constructed nature of these texts, that there are certain tropes that we often find in them. To actually be able to see some of that process, to have an earlier version that then turns into a different final version of the text is just so cool.
Yeah, definitely. So for me, one of the things I talk about with my visionaries is styles of seeing. So it's sort of something that I'm constructing from these lives. I'm not saying there was, a little selection of tropes that were named like this in the Middle Ages. Absolutely not. There's something that I'm sort of using to sort through all these different ways of talking about vision. And in the first Latin life for Dorothea, pretty much all of these styles come into it, including one that's really very ambitious. It's one that says it's a purely internal vision. There was nothing as dramatic as an ecstasy, so nobody could really witness her having the vision. And this is one that Hildegard of Bingen actually claimed to some success, of course, but nearly 300 years earlier. And in the second life, the Vita Lindana, that's completely gone. And John is really only saying she had ecstatic visions, and I, her confessor, really did my due diligence to confirm that these were good, beneficial visions from God. So it's a really clear shift from what I think is something that he decided was, a bit too ambitious, into something that is much more careful and, as you said, aimed towards canonization. So you have this really, careful confirmation from someone outside of the mystic.
I love that. It is not often that we see the discretion of spirits, the discretio spiritum, the interrogation so obviously put forward in the text. But because you've got these two versions, you get to have this examination that says, oh, no, actually, she only had the appropriate kind of visions. And not only that, we've fully checked it out and made sure that it's orthodox and everything is good going forward. Well done, us. And I think I really like that because sometimes the scribe, the confessor, the person writing these things down is seen as an impediment to our understanding of the person that we are looking at. And so we don't really get much further than that. And the examination doesn't really push beyond that. But in this case, we're actually seeing the importance of that role, the importance placed on it, and a little bit even the way that that relationship between the two of them is constructed. And I think that that is also a really interesting area for examination.
No, absolutely. I think that relation between mystic and confessor, scribe, spiritual father, whatever you want to call them, at least from the sources I look at, was really collaborative and constructive. And you can go too far one way and try and cut them out completely. You can go too far the other way and say, I don't have anything from the mystic themselves. It's only what the confessor is saying. And navigating between those two poles is something that I have struggled with, and I'm still working on getting the balance right.
Yeah, I agree. Balance can be a really hard thing to find there, but I still think it's a really interesting, fun, rewarding place to play in. So we've established we have two lives, about the same woman, by the same people. Let's talk a little bit about the biographical information. What do we know about Dorothea and her life?
Right. So she was born, I think, in the middle of the 14th century and died in 1394. She was Prussian. And as far as I know, she was not herself affiliated with a religious order. But when she did move to Marienwerder, I think in the beginning of the 1390s, she moved into a cell by a cathedral that I think was run by the Teutonic Order. And John Marienwerder was a member of the Teutonic Order, and according to some scholars, also a Dominican, but it's a bit unclear to me whether that's actually the case. So as far as I know, she did experience visions from her teens when she was married to some much older man, but it was only later in life, after he died, that she moved into the phase of her religious life that is really covered by John Marienwerder. I don't think her early life was terribly pleasant. She was very devout, and her husband didn't have much time for this. So she had a difficult marriage to begin with, quite a common story from that time.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, all too common of an experience. So she had visions from an early age and then got married. Do we know if she had children? Do we know about her transition from living a quote-unquote normal life to moving into a religious life? Did she become a nun? Do we know how that process happened? Or do these things just kind of pick up once her husband has died and start recording from there?
So she did have children. I think most of them died. So I believe she had 9 children and 4 died in infancy, and then another 4 died during a plague in 1380s. And then she had 1 surviving daughter who did join the Benedictines. As for Dorothea herself, she was in an anchoress's cell next to the cathedral at Marienwerder. And so, well, not exactly a convent, of course, but a more devoted religious life enclosed in that cell.
So do we know how the relationship between her and John Marienwerder started? Was he her confessor originally? Was he just a scribe? Are they part of the same religious community? What do we know about the beginnings of their relationship? And I suppose then kind of how this work came into being.
So I'm not sure how the relationship started. He was definitely her confessor. He says that multiple times throughout both lives and also in the canonization processes, which is another very rich source for the relationship between the two of them. He was, I believe, a deacon at the cathedral, so was affiliated with the cathedral where she was living. He was not her only confessor. She had another confessor who pops up in the canonization process, but was not her scribe or hagiographer.
Okay. Do we know anything else about her life? Any of her daily experiences? You mentioned she's walled in as an anchoress. Do we have mentions of people visiting her? Do we know anything about daily routines? Anything like that? Or are these works just recordings of her revelations?
So these lives are primarily recording her revelations. People did come to see her to seek advice and consolation and that sort of thing. Interestingly, there is a German vernacular life that John Marienwerder wrote for her, which gives much more detail about her married life. I have not studied that in any detail, but that one is much more aimed towards giving a sort of model to imitate for a sort of good housewife, according to Cordelia Hess, who is someone who has studied Dorothea in great detail as well.
All right. Well, since these works are about the revelations, let's talk about those. Are there any kind of key themes that we see coming through in her visions? Is there any sort of fixation on particular imagery? Are there particular messages that she really focuses on? What are her revelations like? Tell me everything about them.
Yeah. So one really important theme that jumped out to me, mainly based on my interests, I would say, but I think it is very prevalent in the lives, is how multi-sensory her revelations are. So sure, I talk about seeing, but Marienwerder goes into a great deal of detail about how she could smell the sweetness with her internal sense of smell. She could hear beautiful music. She could feel things. Oh, and one very interesting bit, something that she feels, is she feels her heart taken out of her body and replaced with a fleshy lump that was a flame and replaced in her body. So it's really visceral and graphic, and yeah, really giving a multi-sensory idea of what these revelations were like. And she's certainly not unique in that, but it's something that I found really striking as I was reading.
Okay, hold on. Sorry. Her heart is taken out and replaced with a burning, fleshy lump.
Yes.
Why? Why did that happen?
So that's not elaborated on in any great detail, but I think what we're talking about there is, you know, the burning ardor and love for Christ, right? And it allows her mind, her intellect to be illuminated with greater knowledge of divine truth. So it's that really fascinating melding of body and mind that you get so much in the Middle Ages, but it is difficult for us sometimes to understand with our, heritage of mind-body dualism. So yeah, her heart being removed and replaced gives her this new mental clarity for divine truth.
That is so interesting to me, because what was her regular normal human heart doing or not doing that this lump of burning flesh is somehow going to be able to facilitate instead? These are the questions. This is what I want to know. Why was this lump of flesh better?
No, that's a really good question, and one I don't have a certain answer to, because you would think her heart was what was doing the loving. So how is it something that needs to be removed? I think it could be recognition of her love and a sort of upgraded heart, like recognition and manifestation of how strong her love was with the flames. But that is a little speculative because, as I said, it sort of breezes past it.
Let's talk a little bit about the sensory nature of this smelling then, because smelling sweetness, tasting sweetness, that is very common in mystical experience. But is there a particular way that she's engaging with this? Is it happening to her in real life, as it were, or is this more happening in a visionary state? How are we finding her senses working in this case?
So these sensory experiences do primarily happen in a visionary state, and what her confessor is interested in emphasizing is that it's her internal senses that are being stimulated in this way. So it's not something that happens all the time. She has all these internal sensations, and we don't always hear so much about what is happening externally.
Great. So let's talk about materiality then, because one of the things we get sometimes when we're talking about mysticism is this is all happening in the mind, in the soul. Sometimes we get really detailed descriptions of what's being seen, of objects in space, creating this kind of material world within the spiritual. But sometimes we don't, and it's more light and symbolism and feeling, very emotional. So what are we talking about with Dorothea when we're talking about materiality in this way?
So in the first life that Marienwerder writes, he talks about Dorothea having sometimes bodily visions experienced through her bodily eyes, sometimes ecstatic visions, which are experienced internally but are visible and can have very physical sensations attached to them. And he also talks about the purely internal ones where there's no physical sensation at all. So to begin with, he hasn't really decided how he feels on materiality, I think. So is it a valid way of getting divine revelation or not? We're not sure from that first life. Then in the second one, the one that seems to be more of a revision of that first one, where he's more certain of what he wants to emphasize and what he wants to de-emphasize, he mainly speaks about ecstatic visions. For me, materiality comes into that in two ways. So firstly, you have the extreme sensations that she's getting mainly internally, with the heart being removed and the fleshy lump being put in. I don't think we're supposed to understand that her chest literally caught on fire, but for her, the sensation was as strong, if not stronger, than if it had happened literally. And the other way that materiality comes into that is we hear about her being tested for whether it was ecstasy. And one of the ways to test that we read about a lot in the sources, like all sorts of saints and mystics who were said to feel ecstasy, would be tested by, stimulating their external senses. So, touching them sometimes quite harshly, shouting for them. And if they didn't respond or react in any way, then that was a proof of ecstasy. So we hear about the internal pain described in a very visceral way, and also about external actors trying to use her physical senses to test whether it was true ecstasy or not.
So to what extent did they test her? Because obviously you've mentioned that he makes a point of saying, yes, we tested, we checked, these are orthodox. And that is something that is really emphasized. But when I think about the testing of mystics, I think of like Duceline de Dean and people like sticking her with things to make sure that she really was in ecstasy, or even Marjorie Kemp with people really wanting to fight with her every time she goes anywhere to challenge her views, to make sure that they then come away agreeing with her in the end, but that kind of challenge. So do we have those kinds of dramatic moments, or is it more of a, hey, we asked her, we checked, we did the due diligence, and now we're good, so we're just going to write it all down?
I would say she's not tested very much. Certainly by comparison to the two you've just mentioned, even by comparison to someone like Catherine of Siena. Yes, I think that John Marienwerder is very savvy in the way that he is writing about her. And a lot of that, I think you get from the difference between the first life and the second one, because he's not trying to claim anything too exceptional. Her revelations are all within the expected sphere of what divine revelation should be. They match with biblical interpretation and the teachings of the church and so on. At this point, 1390s ecstasy isn't that new. And yeah, she's not a disruptive figure, according to Marienwerder at least. So you get a little bit more discussion of exactly how she was interrogated in the canonization process. But yeah, it's very much saying this is nothing new. We checked that everything was in line with church teaching. We examined her and that she was of sound mind. So I think it's more sort of gesturing towards the fact that this sort of proof is necessary without it being a massive theme that it has been in others. Like Catherine of Siena is who springs to mind for me.
So is there a moment or a revelation or even an image from her lives that you find the most compelling or that comes to the forefront of your mind when you think about Dorothea?
So I have already mentioned the fleshy lump completely aflame. That is one of my favourites. Reading that and trying to translate it, yeah, that one stood out. But another one that I do enjoy, because it does seem very much quite explicitly constructed to make her seem a very conscientious and obedient sort of mystic. And it's just describing God talking to her and telling her that she needs to go and speak to her two confessors to be examined, and then they will be infused with knowledge that she has not been tricked or deceived. So the fact that she's told to go and speak to her confessor is something that I find quite striking. And I think this is one of the moments where possibly Dorothea herself, possibly John Marienwerder, most likely both of them together, are, coming up with ways to really convince that she is to be trusted and that these revelations were truly divine. They're covering all their bases. She's experienced ecstasy, she's checked it out with her confessors, and yeah, she has this humility and obedience towards them.
I love that we see the command to speak to her confessor so direct and obvious, because the receipt of these kinds of revelations often comes with some sort of call to reveal them. The mystic wondering whether or not they should, sometimes becoming very ill until the point when they do finally confess them, and that's kind of a passive acknowledgement of the fact that sharing them was the right thing to do. But to have in the revelation itself say, no, you're not going to understand this by yourself. Go and talk to your confessor. Go get the exegesis. Go get the proper understanding of what's going on. It's just so forthright and makes the necessity of that relationship so clear and obvious to everyone involved.
Sure. Yeah, it is really quite extreme. And it happens to an extent here in Dorothea's lives. And what you're describing comes through even more clearly in Francis of Rome's canonization processes and lives as well. She's quite a bit later, 1440s was when she died. Yes, for Francis of Rome, it's absolutely must speak to the confessor, another man named John. There's so many Johns in my thesis. John Mattiotti is presented at least as the interpreter of all the visions. Like there's about 90 visions that he takes down, and everyone is introduced with through obedience she spoke to her spiritual father and she said, and then he explains what that means, basically. So, yeah, that level of obedience is not quite there with Dorothea, but it's something that they sort of gesture towards.
I really wonder if that is a 14th century reaction to the mysticism of the 13th century that sometimes seems to have this vibe of, no, I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I will actually fight you on it.
Yes, I do think there is absolutely a sort of reaction going on here. And you've got this general trend, certainly by the middle of the 15th century, towards very, very careful certification of things that are not obvious to everyone, things that could be ambiguous. I don't have too many sources from the 13th century, but I do like your idea of this is what happened and I'll fight you on it.
I have definitely encountered quite a few feisty 13th century mystics who just know their own mind, and I genuinely love that about them. With these lives, you mentioned that they are more focused on the recounting of her revelations. Do we really get a sense of her as a person within them, or is she treated more as a conduit for these messages?
I would say not really. Again, distortions can of course arise from what the researcher is looking for, and for me I'm looking for visions and revelations above all, so that's forefront in my mind. But the sense that I get is not really of much of an individual from these writings. Yeah, she does seem quite separated from Dorothea the human, to me at least. When she is talked about as a person, it's very much about her virtues, her obedience, her humility. So it's still very in line with the tropes of sort of feminine sainthood, or sanctity at least. So I do think that she is quite difficult to access through these sources, and I think that is partly by design. As I've mentioned already, she's not meant to be anything particularly challenging. Like, of course, she is special. She's getting these visions that are beneficial to the church, is a phrase that is used. But since a lot of the revelations that are recorded are from later in her life as well, I think you do get the impression of someone who is now finally able to just be enclosed in a cell and experience these revelations. And it's almost like she's left her life behind. Like, that doesn't really interest her or John Marienwerder anymore. And since it seems that her life before was quite painful, maybe, it's almost like a refuge, and she doesn't want to be remembered for what her marriage was like. She wants the visions and her relationship with God and also her confessor to be her legacy. But that was very speculative, all that.
Hey, we love some speculation here. Why not? It does make sense, though, with the idea of an anchorite and that kind of closing off of the self and abandoning the previous life, that if the work doesn't start recording until after she's already taken on that change, that we wouldn't really be seeing an individual, a person in that same way, because that was supposed to have been abandoned and rejected, and that self is attempting to be gone in some way. So, yeah, it would make a lot of sense that that's not something that we're really seeing by that point. In comparison, especially to someone who is at the other end of the spectrum, uncloistered, traveling around, and making a wonderful nuisance of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm just thinking, comparing her to someone like Catherine of Siena again. We read a lot about Catherine's relationship with her sisters and how she cares for them, and it's a much more sort of communal sense of a holy person. But in Dorothea's hagiographies, really the only relationships you hear about are Dorothea and Christ, Dorothea and John Marienwerder, and not even the other confessor. The other confessor, John Raymond, pretty much only comes in to the canonization inquiry when he is, of course, interrogated. Yeah, it's a much more closed, separated life, as you say.
Amazing. So, with so little information about who she was and what she was like, we can't really know that much more about her. You study so many holy figures from this period. I'm just wondering, as we come towards the end of the podcast, Why did you want to talk about Dorothea? What makes her your favorite mystic?
So there's a couple of reasons, I think. One is she's not massively well known, so I wanted to talk about her some more in a bit more of an informal way. I've given a paper on her before, but it's such a great opportunity to talk about her on this podcast where you get, people talking about someone as famous as Hildegard of Bingen. And yeah, I wanted to represent Dorothea just because she's not that well known from what I can tell. And the other reason really goes back to the sort of excitement I had when I was reading about her for the first time, because there's just such a wealth of information about her visions, not so much about her as a person, as we've said, and her canonization. So the miracles that she produced after her death, there's quite a lot of stories of people having visions of her after praying to her, and then she gives them cures, and yeah, those visions are like evidence that it was her that cured them. Yeah, there's just really so much to talk about her visions that, yeah, I just really enjoy sharing that with people.
On this note of people asking her for things and then receiving them, these miraculous interventions, was this all posthumous, or do we have examples of this from during her life as well?
Those are the after-death miracles mostly, yeah. Oh, and one other thing that makes her my favourite mystic are those really sort of out-of-the-blue graphic imagery. It plays into the excitement of how much there is, but these sort of out-of-the-blue visions that aren't really interpreted for you. So, yeah, just sort of trying to unpick what's really going on there is just really fun.
Is she known, or does she get a reputation for curing certain things, or are these more generic requests that come as part of the canonization proceedings?
It's mainly part of the canonization documents. There's a lot of miracles around blindness. That's pretty common generally. I can't call to mind any specific thing that she's known for that really sets her apart there. It's just your post-mortem miracles for canonization.
Fantastic. We are unfortunately out of time, but Genevieve, thank you so much for being here today and for telling me all about Dorothea of Montau.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to chat.
It was great having you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic and join me next time when I speak to Rowan Wilson about Walter Hilton.